Sarah Mitchell adjusted her tactical vest one final time as the helicopter descended toward the compound. The rotor blades cut through the thick Afghan night air, creating a rhythmic thump that matched her heartbeat. She had been a Navy SEAL for 8 years, one of only a handful of women to complete the grueling training and earn the Trident. Tonight's mission was supposed to be routine: extract a high-value intelligence asset from a Taliban stronghold and get out clean. The briefing had been straightforward. Intel suggested minimal resistance, maybe a dozen guards at most. The asset, a former Taliban commander who had turned informant, was being held in a concrete building on the outskirts of Kandahar. Sarah's team would fast rope down, secure the package, and extract within 20 minutes. Simple, clean, professional. As the helicopter hovered 50 feet above the target zone, Sarah caught the eye of her team leader, Commander Jake Rodriguez. They had worked together for 3 years, and she could read the concern in his weathered face even through his night vision goggles. Something felt off about this mission from the beginning. The intelligence was too clean, too convenient. But orders were orders, and SEALs followed orders. Sarah checked her weapon one last time, a modified M4 carbine with suppressor attached. Her secondary weapon, a Sig Sauer P226, sat snug in its holster on her thigh. She had trained with these weapons thousands of times, could field strip them blindfolded. But tonight something in her gut told her she might need every round. The rope dropped, and one by one the 6-member team descended into the darkness. Sarah went third, her boots hitting the sandy ground with practiced silence. The compound was eerily quiet, too quiet. No guards walking patrol routes, no cigarette glows in the darkness, no casual chatter that usually accompanied relaxed security details. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Rodriguez hand signaled the team to move toward the main building. They advanced in a tactical formation, weapons ready, each SEAL covering a different angle. Sarah took point position, her night vision revealing empty guard towers and unattended checkpoints. This wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. Taliban commanders never left their strongholds unguarded, especially when holding valuable prisoners. As they approached the concrete structure, Sarah noticed fresh tire tracks in the sand. Multiple vehicles, heavy ones, had been here recently. The tracks led away from the compound in different directions, suggesting a hasty evacuation. She tapped Rodriguez on the shoulder and pointed to the evidence, but he motioned for the team to continue the mission. The building's front door stood slightly ajar. Sarah aimed her weapon at the opening, while Rodriguez prepared to enter. The hinges creaked as he pushed the door open, the sound echoing through the empty corridors like a warning bell. Inside, their flashlights revealed abandoned rooms, overturned furniture, and the unmistakable signs of a quick departure. They moved room by room, clearing each space methodically. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Check corners, watch for tripwires, listen for sounds that didn't belong. But the building was empty, completely empty. No asset, no guards, no Taliban fighters. Just concrete walls and the lingering smell of diesel fuel and cigarettes. In what appeared to be the main holding area, they found evidence of recent occupation. Blankets were still warm, tea glasses half full, and papers scattered across a makeshift desk. But no people. Sarah examined the papers while Rodriguez coordinated with their helicopter pilot. The documents were in Pashto, but she recognized enough words to understand they were movement orders dated just hours earlier. Rodriguez's voice came through her earpiece, tense and clipped. The helicopter pilot reported unusual radio chatter in the area. Taliban forces were mobilizing from multiple directions, converging on their position. What had started as a simple extraction was rapidly becoming a nightmare scenario. Sarah suggested they abort immediately, but Rodriguez was reluctant to return empty-handed. Command would want explanations, and coming back without the asset or solid intelligence would raise uncomfortable questions about their mission planning. He ordered the team to conduct a more thorough search of the compound, looking for any intelligence materials that might salvage the operation. As they spread out to search the remaining buildings, Sarah noticed movement on the ridgeline overlooking the compound. Tiny flickers of light, barely visible even with night vision, but unmistakably human. She counted at least 12 positions, all with clear lines of sight into the compound. Her blood ran cold as she realized the truth. They hadn't walked into an abandoned stronghold. They had walked into a carefully prepared trap. She keyed her radio to warn Rodriguez, but before she could speak, the first shot rang out. The bullet struck the concrete wall inches from her head, sending chips of stone flying. Then came the second shot and the third, and suddenly the night exploded with muzzle flashes from the surrounding hills. Sarah dove for cover behind a low wall as bullets whined overhead. Her training took over, and she began returning fire at the muzzle flashes on the ridgeline. But there were too many of them, and they had the high ground. The Taliban had used their own asset as bait, sacrificing him to lure American special forces into a kill zone. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio, calling for immediate extraction. But the helicopter couldn't land under heavy fire, and the Taliban fighters were closing in from multiple directions. Sarah realized with growing dread that they were surrounded, outnumbered, and trapped in an expertly planned ambush. As bullets continued to rain down on their position, Sarah Mitchell understood that tonight would test everything she had learned in 8 years as a Navy SEAL. The enemy had made one crucial mistake, though they assumed that because she was a woman, she would be easier to break than her male counterparts. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The firefight intensified as Taliban fighters moved closer to the compound walls. Sarah counted muzzle flashes and calculated angles of attack, her mind working with the cold precision that had made her one of the Navy's elite warriors. She had survived worse odds before, and she had no intention of dying in this godforsaken compound. The Taliban wanted a fight, and they were about to get one they would never forget. The gunfire grew heavier as more Taliban fighters joined the assault. Sarah pressed herself against the concrete wall, feeling the vibrations as bullets struck the other side. She could hear Rodriguez coordinating with the other team members through the radio, but their situation was deteriorating rapidly. The enemy had them pinned down with crossfire from multiple elevated positions. Sarah assessed their tactical situation with practiced efficiency. They were trapped in a compound roughly 50 meters square, with minimal cover and no clear escape routes. The Taliban controlled the high ground on 3 sides, and more fighters were approaching from the valley floor. Their helicopter circled overhead but couldn't risk landing under such heavy fire. Through her night vision scope, Sarah identified at least 20 enemy positions. The Taliban fighters were well equipped and disciplined, nothing like the ragtag insurgents they usually encountered. Someone had planned this ambush carefully, studying American special operations tactics and preparing countermeasures. This wasn't just a trap, it was a sophisticated military operation. Rodriguez crawled over to Sarah's position, staying low to avoid sniper fire. His face was grim as he updated her on their situation. 2 team members were wounded. Ammunition was running low, and the enemy was preparing for a final assault. The helicopter pilot estimated they had maybe 10 minutes before Taliban reinforcements arrived from nearby villages. Sarah studied the compound layout, looking for any advantage they could exploit. The main building offered decent cover, but it was also a potential death trap if they got cornered inside. The outer walls were too low to provide protection from elevated shooting positions, and the gate they had entered through was now completely exposed to enemy fire. But Sarah noticed something the Taliban commanders had overlooked in their planning. The compound's water well was positioned near the eastern wall, and the ground around it was slightly elevated. If she could reach that position, she would have a clear shot at the fighters on the nearest ridgeline. More importantly, she could provide covering fire for her team to reach better defensive positions. She explained her plan to Rodriguez, who immediately shook his head. The distance to the well was 30 meters across open ground, all of it exposed to enemy fire. It would be a suicide run, and he couldn't authorize it. But Sarah had already made up her mind. As the only team member in an uninjured condition with a clear shot at the eastern positions, she was their best hope for breaking the enemy's crossfire. Before Rodriguez could stop her, Sarah sprinted from cover toward the well. The Taliban fighters spotted her immediately, and dozens of muzzle flashes erupted from the hillsides. Bullets whined past her ears and kicked up sand at her feet, but she kept running. Her 8 years of SEAL training had prepared her for moments like this, when survival depended on speed, courage, and refusing to accept defeat. She dove behind the well's stone wall just as a burst of automatic fire swept across her previous position. The Taliban fighters had expected her to stay pinned down with the rest of her team, and her aggressive move had disrupted their tactical plan. Now she had a flanking position on their eastern shooters, and she intended to make them pay for underestimating her. Sarah steadied her M4 carbine against the stone wall and began engaging targets. Her first shot dropped a Taliban fighter who had been directing fire at Rodriguez's position. Her second shot silenced a machine gun nest that had been keeping her team pinned down. She worked methodically through the enemy positions, using single, well-aimed shots to conserve ammunition. The Taliban fighters began shifting their fire towards Sarah's new position, realizing the threat she posed to their ambush. But from behind the well, she had better cover than they had anticipated, and her superior marksmanship training gave her a significant advantage. She continued picking off enemy fighters, forcing them to abandon their elevated positions or take cover. Rodriguez seized the opportunity Sarah had created, leading the rest of the team to better defensive positions inside the main building. From there, they could provide mutual supporting fire and establish a more defensible perimeter. The wounded team members were moved to the building's interior, where they could receive medical attention while staying protected from enemy fire. But the Taliban commanders weren't finished. Sarah heard the rumble of approaching vehicles and saw headlights moving through the valley below the compound. Reinforcements were arriving, including what appeared to be a technical truck mounted with a heavy machine gun. The enemy was escalating the engagement, determined to wipe out the American Special Operations Team. Sarah knew they had minutes at most before the situation became completely hopeless. The helicopter couldn't extract them under heavy fire, and they lacked the ammunition for a prolonged firefight against superior numbers. But she also knew that Taliban fighters, despite their preparation and numbers, had made one critical error in their planning. They had assumed that trapping a Navy SEAL team would be enough to guarantee victory. They had studied American tactics and prepared their ambush carefully, but they had underestimated the psychological factor. SEALs weren't trained just to fight. They were trained to win regardless of odds or circumstances. And Sarah Mitchell had never lost a firefight in 8 years of combat operations. As the Taliban reinforcements moved into position, Sarah began planning her next move. The enemy expected her to stay pinned down, waiting passively for extraction or death. Instead, she was going to do what SEALs did best: take the fight to the enemy when they least expected it. The technical truck with the heavy machine gun was setting up on the road below the compound, positioning itself to rake the main building with suppressing fire. Once that gun was operational, her team would be trapped inside with no way to return fire effectively. Sarah realized she had perhaps 2 minutes to neutralize that threat before it became operational. She checked her ammunition, 18 rounds left in her current magazine, plus 2 full magazines in her gear. Her secondary weapon had a full load and she carried 4 fragmentation grenades. Not much for fighting 20 or more enemy fighters, but it would have to be enough. Sarah keyed her radio and spoke to Rodriguez. She was going after the heavy weapon, and she needed the team to provide diversionary fire on her signal. Rodriguez tried to talk her out of it, but Sarah was already moving. The Taliban had made the mistake of thinking they could intimidate a Navy SEAL by surrounding her with superior numbers. They were about to learn that SEALs don't break under pressure. They adapt, improvise, and strike back harder than anyone expects. Sarah moved through the shadows along the compound's eastern wall, using the darkness and stone barriers to mask her approach toward the road. The Taliban fighters were focused on the main building where Rodriguez and the team were positioned, giving her the element of surprise she needed. The technical truck's heavy machine gun was almost ready to fire, its crew making final adjustments to the mounting system. She counted 4 fighters around the vehicle: a gunner, a loader, a driver, and what appeared to be a commander coordinating the attack. They were speaking in hushed Pashto, confident that their ambush was proceeding according to plan. Sarah understood enough of their language to catch fragments of their conversation. They were discussing how to position the gun for maximum effect against the building where her teammates were trapped. The compound wall ended about 20 meters from the road, leaving open ground between Sarah and her targets. She would have to cross that distance quickly and silently, then engage 4 armed fighters at close range before they could react. It was exactly the kind of high-risk, high-reward tactical situation that SEAL training prepared operators to handle. Sarah pulled a fragmentation grenade from her gear and calculated the timing. She would throw the grenade first to disrupt the enemy fighters, then close the distance while they were recovering from the explosion. The plan relied on speed, surprise, and the psychological shock of a sudden attack from an unexpected direction. She keyed her radio one final time, whispering to Rodriguez that she was beginning her assault. On her signal, the team would open fire on the hillside positions to draw attention away from the road. Rodriguez acknowledged grimly, knowing that Sarah was risking everything on a desperate gambit to save the team. Sarah pulled the grenade pin and counted off 3 seconds before lobbing it toward the technical truck. The explosion lit up the night sky and sent the Taliban fighters diving for cover. In the chaos that followed, Sarah sprinted across the open ground with her M4 carbine ready to fire. The first fighter she encountered was stumbling away from the destroyed vehicle. Temporarily blinded by the explosion, Sarah put 2 rounds center mass and moved toward the next target. The commander was shouting orders and trying to rally his men, but a burst from Sarah's rifle silenced him permanently. The driver had taken cover behind the truck's cab and was returning fire with an AK-47. His shots went wide in the darkness, but Sarah's training allowed her to place accurate shots even while moving. She flanked around the vehicle and eliminated him with a precise shot to the head. The gunner had been thrown clear by the grenade explosion but was still alive and reaching for his sidearm. Sarah approached cautiously, keeping her rifle trained on him. In broken English, he cursed her and reached for a backup weapon hidden in his clothing. Sarah didn't hesitate. Another well-placed shot ended the threat. With the heavy weapon neutralized, Sarah turned her attention back to the hillside positions. The Taliban fighters were still engaged with Rodriguez's team, but their tactical advantage was diminishing. Without the technical truck's heavy machine gun, they couldn't pin down the SEALs inside the building, and Sarah's flanking attack had disrupted their coordinated assault. But Sarah's aggressive move had also revealed her position to the enemy commanders. Taliban fighters on the nearest ridgeline were now directing sustained fire at the road where she had engaged the truck crew. She was exposed with limited cover, and more enemy reinforcements were approaching from the valley. Sarah assessed her situation quickly. She had eliminated an immediate threat, but she was now isolated from her team and surrounded by hostile forces. The smart tactical decision would be to retreat to the compound and rejoin Rodriguez's defensive position. But Sarah noticed something that changed her calculations entirely. The Taliban fighters were using a specific radio frequency for their tactical communications, and their commander was positioned on the central ridgeline overlooking the compound. She could see his position clearly through her night vision scope. He was surrounded by bodyguards and coordinating the entire ambush through a handheld radio. If Sarah could eliminate the enemy commander, the Taliban attack would lose its coordination and discipline. Without central leadership, the individual fighting positions would become easier targets for her team to engage. It was a high-risk strategy, but potentially the key to turning the entire battle in their favor. The approach to the commander's position would require Sarah to move through enemy territory, climbing the rocky hillside while avoiding numerous Taliban fighters. She would be completely on her own, with no support from her team and no easy retreat route if things went wrong. But she had identified the enemy's critical vulnerability, and SEAL doctrine emphasized exploiting such opportunities regardless of personal risk. Sarah began moving toward the hillside, using rocks and vegetation for concealment. The Taliban fighters were focused on the compound below, giving her opportunities to advance undetected. She moved slowly and carefully, taking advantage of every shadow and terrain feature to mask her approach. As she climbed higher, Sarah could hear the enemy commander's voice more clearly. He was speaking rapidly into his radio, coordinating fire patterns and positioning reinforcements. His tone was confident and professional. This was clearly an experienced military leader, not a typical Taliban fighter. Someone with formal training had planned and was executing this ambush. Sarah positioned herself within 50 meters of the command position, close enough to engage with her rifle, but still concealed in the rocky terrain. She counted 6 fighters around the commander, all armed with automatic weapons and positioned to provide security. Taking out the entire group would require precise timing and maximum effectiveness from her remaining ammunition. She pulled her last 2 grenades and prepared for the most dangerous part of her plan. The enemy commander was the key to the Taliban's tactical coordination, but he was also the most heavily defended target on the battlefield. Sarah would have to eliminate him and his bodyguards quickly, then escape before other enemy fighters could respond to the attack. As she prepared for the assault, Sarah thought about the 8 years of training that had brought her to this moment. Every obstacle course, every marksmanship drill, Every tactical exercise had been preparing her for situations exactly like this. The Navy had invested millions of dollars and thousands of hours training her to be an elite warrior, and tonight she would prove that investment worthwhile. The Taliban fighters had made their biggest mistake when they decided to ambush a Navy SEAL team. They had superior numbers and better positions, but they were facing operators trained to overcome exactly those disadvantages. Sarah Mitchell was about to show them what happened when you tried to break someone who had been forged in the crucible of SEAL training. Sarah crept closer to the enemy command position, moving like a shadow among the rocks. The Taliban commander continued coordinating his forces, unaware that death was approaching from below. His bodyguards maintained their security positions but were focused outward, watching for threats from the compound rather than from the hillside behind them. At 40 meters distance, Sarah could see the commander clearly through her scope. He was older than the typical Taliban fighter, probably in his 50s with the bearing of a professional soldier. His equipment was better than his subordinates: newer weapons, military-grade communications gear, and tactical clothing that suggested formal training. This wasn't just a local insurgent leader. This was someone with serious military experience. Sarah positioned her first grenade for maximum effect against the bodyguards, then prepared her rifle for precision shots at any survivors. The plan was simple but dangerous: create chaos with the explosive, then eliminate remaining threats before they could organize a response. She would have perhaps 10 seconds to complete the entire engagement before other Taliban fighters converged on her position. She pulled the pin on her first grenade and lobbed it toward the center of the enemy group. The explosion shattered the night silence and sent bodies flying in all directions. Sarah immediately followed up with her second grenade, targeting the command position where the Taliban leader had been standing. The double explosion created exactly the chaos she needed to press her attack. Through the smoke and confusion, Sarah saw the commander struggling to his feet, wounded but still alive. 2 of his bodyguards were down permanently, but 3 others were reaching for their weapons despite injuries from the grenade blasts. Sarah engaged them systematically with her rifle, placing accurate shots even in the poor visibility created by the explosions. The first bodyguard fell before he could bring his AK-47 to bear. The second managed to fire a burst that went wide, but Sarah's return fire was precisely on target. The third fighter was more alert and found cover behind a large rock, forcing Sarah to maneuver for a better angle of attack. Meanwhile, the Taliban commander was speaking urgently into his radio, trying to coordinate a response to Sarah's assault. Even wounded and under fire, he was attempting to maintain control of his forces. Sarah realized that as long as he remained alive and functional, the enemy would continue operating as a coordinated unit. Sarah flanked around the rocky outcropping where the last bodyguard had taken cover. She moved quickly but carefully, knowing that other Taliban fighters would be responding to the explosions and gunfire. Time was running out, and she needed to complete her mission before enemy reinforcements arrived. The bodyguard behind the rock was waiting for her, and they engaged in a brief but intense firefight at close range. His AK-47 had superior firepower, but Sarah's training and superior positioning gave her the advantage. She used controlled bursts from her M4 to keep him pinned down while maneuvering for a clear shot. When the Taliban fighter exposed himself to fire at her new position, Sarah was ready. Her shot was perfectly placed, ending the threat and clearing her path to the enemy commander. But as she moved toward her primary target, she heard the distinctive sound of more vehicles approaching from the valley below. The Taliban commander was still trying to coordinate his forces through his radio, blood streaming down his face from grenade fragments, but his voice still strong and commanding. Sarah approached carefully, keeping her rifle trained on him while scanning for additional threats. She needed him eliminated, but she also needed any intelligence he might possess about Taliban operations in the area. As Sarah reached the command position, the wounded Taliban leader looked up at her with a mixture of surprise and respect. He had not expected to be facing a woman in American Special Forces gear, and the realization that a female operator had single-handedly destroyed his carefully planned ambush clearly shocked him. In broken English, he spoke to Sarah with the professionalism of one soldier addressing another. He acknowledged that she had fought well and disrupted his tactical plan effectively, but he also warned her that more fighters were coming, and that her team would not survive the night regardless of her individual heroics. Sarah ignored his psychological warfare and focused on extracting information. She asked about Taliban force dispositions in the area, supply routes, and command structures. The wounded commander initially refused to cooperate, but the pain from his injuries and the psychological impact of his tactical defeat began to wear down his resistance. Through patient questioning, Sarah learned that this ambush was part of a larger Taliban operation targeting American Special Forces teams. Multiple SEAL and Special Forces units were being tracked and targeted, using intelligence provided by someone with access to classified mission planning. The Taliban weren't just getting lucky with their ambushes, they had inside information about American operations. This revelation changed everything about Sarah's mission priorities. If the Taliban had a source inside American military planning, then other SEAL teams were walking into similar traps across Afghanistan. The intelligence she was gathering from this wounded commander could save dozens of American lives and expose a critical security breach. But as she continued her interrogation, Sarah heard sounds of approaching Taliban fighters climbing the hillside toward their position. The enemy reinforcements had arrived and were conducting a systematic search for whoever had attacked their command post. She had maybe 5 minutes before they reached her position. Sarah faced a critical decision. She could execute the Taliban commander and attempt to escape back to her team, taking the intelligence she had already gathered. Or she could risk everything by staying longer to extract more detailed information about the Taliban's intelligence source and planned operations against American forces. The professional thing to do would be to eliminate the enemy leader and withdraw immediately. Her primary mission was to survive and rejoin her team, not to conduct extended intelligence gathering under fire. But the information this commander possessed could prevent future ambushes and save American lives across the theater of operations. Sarah made her choice. She would stay and continue the interrogation, using every technique she had learned in SEAL training to extract maximum intelligence from the wounded Taliban leader. The approaching enemy fighters added urgency to her questioning, but also provided leverage. The commander could hear his own men coming to rescue him, and Sarah made it clear that his survival depended on his cooperation. The Taliban leader began providing more detailed information about planned operations, force strengths, and communication procedures. Sarah memorized every detail while keeping watch for approaching enemy fighters. She was pushing her luck by staying in this exposed position, but the intelligence value was enormous. As the sound of Taliban fighters grew closer, Sarah prepared for the next phase of her escape. She had accomplished far more than anyone could have expected, neutralizing the enemy's tactical leadership, disrupting their coordinated assault, and gathering critical intelligence about future threats. Now she had to survive long enough to get that information back to American commanders. Sarah heard the Taliban search teams getting closer, their voices echoing off the rocky hillside as they climbed toward the command position. She had extracted as much intelligence as possible from the wounded commander, but now she faced the challenge of escaping through enemy territory while carrying information that could save dozens of American lives. The Taliban leader had given her detailed information about their intelligence source, a contractor working at Bagram Airfield who had access to mission planning databases. He provided names, communication methods, and scheduled intelligence transfers. This wasn't just tactical information. It was strategic intelligence that could expose an entire enemy network. Sarah checked her remaining ammunition, 6 rounds in her current magazine plus 1 full spare. Her sidearm was loaded, and she still carried her combat knife and remaining survival gear. It wasn't much for fighting through multiple enemy positions, but she had been in worse situations during her 8 years as a SEAL. The wounded Taliban commander was unconscious now, having lost too much blood from his grenade injuries. Sarah made a quick decision about his fate. He was no longer a threat, and executing a wounded prisoner would violate the rules of engagement. She gathered his radio and any documents from the command post, then prepared to move. Sarah began her descent down the opposite side of the hill, away from the approaching Taliban search teams. The terrain was rocky and treacherous in the darkness, but it offered concealment from enemy fighters. She moved carefully, testing each foothold to avoid creating noise that might alert the searchers to her position. As she climbed down the hillside, Sarah could hear the Taliban fighters discovering their dead commander and the destroyed command post. Their voices rose in anger and confusion as they realized the extent of the damage one American operator had inflicted on their carefully planned operation. Some were calling for revenge, others for tactical withdrawal. Sarah reached the bottom of the hill and found herself in a narrow valley about half a mile from the compound, where Rodriguez and her team were still fighting. The sounds of gunfire continued from that direction, indicating that her teammates were still holding their defensive positions. But between Sarah and the compound lay open ground patrolled by Taliban fighters. She studied the enemy patrol patterns through her night vision equipment, identifying gaps in their coverage that she could exploit. The Taliban fighters were spread thin, trying to maintain their siege of the compound, while searching for whoever had attacked their command post. Their tactical discipline was breaking down without central leadership. Sarah began moving through the valley, using drainage ditches and rock formations for concealment. She moved slowly and deliberately, stopping frequently to observe enemy positions and plan her next movement. The intelligence she carried was too valuable to risk in a hasty assault across open ground. As she approached the compound perimeter, Sarah noticed that the Taliban's coordinated fire had become sporadic and disorganized. Without their commander's radio coordination, individual fighting positions were operating independently, creating gaps in their tactical coverage that her team could exploit. Sarah reached a position within 200 meters of the compound and established radio contact with Rodriguez. She reported her status and the intelligence she had gathered, including the critical information about the security breach at Bagram airfield. Rodriguez was amazed that she had survived her solo assault and extracted such valuable information. But their tactical situation remained critical. The helicopter was still unable to land under fire, and Taliban reinforcements continued arriving from nearby villages. Even with their leadership disrupted, the enemy still had superior numbers and controlled most of the high ground around the compound. Sarah proposed a new plan based on what she had observed during her infiltration of enemy positions. The Taliban fighters were now operating without central coordination, making them vulnerable to a coordinated assault from multiple directions. If she could create diversionary attacks from the outside while Rodriguez's team pushed out from the compound, they might be able to break the siege entirely. Rodriguez was reluctant to authorize such a risky plan, but their alternatives were limited. Staying defensive in the compound would eventually lead to defeat as Taliban reinforcements arrived. The helicopter couldn't extract them under fire, and they were running low on ammunition for a prolonged defense. Sarah moved into position for her diversionary attack, targeting the Taliban fighters who were maintaining the siege from the northern ridgeline. These fighters had no idea that their command structure had been eliminated, and they were still following their original tactical plan despite changed circumstances. Using her remaining ammunition strategically, Sarah began engaging targets from their blind side. Her first shots eliminated 2 Taliban fighters who had been directing fire at the compound. Her follow-up shots forced others to abandon their elevated positions and seek cover from this unexpected threat. The psychological impact of Sarah's attack was greater than its immediate tactical effect. The Taliban fighters realized that American forces were operating behind their lines, disrupting their rear areas, and eliminating their leadership. Without radio coordination from their destroyed command post, they couldn't determine the size or location of this new threat. Rodriguez seized the opportunity Sarah had created, leading his team in a coordinated breakout from the compound. They moved aggressively against Taliban positions that had been weakened by the loss of central coordination and the confusion created by Sarah's diversionary attacks. The combination of Sarah's external pressure and Rodriguez's internal assault shattered the Taliban siege. Enemy fighters began withdrawing to more defensible positions, abandoning their carefully prepared ambush sites. Their tactical plan had depended on coordination and overwhelming firepower, but both advantages had been neutralized by Sarah's solo actions. As the Taliban forces withdrew, the helicopter pilot reported that he could now approach for extraction. The landing zone was still dangerous, but the reduction in enemy fire made a quick extraction possible. Sarah and Rodriguez coordinated their movements to reach the extraction point simultaneously. Sarah reached the compound as the helicopter touched down, its rotors creating a whirlwind of dust and debris. Rodriguez and the team were moving the wounded toward the aircraft, while maintaining security against possible Taliban counterattacks. The extraction had to be completed quickly before enemy forces could reorganize and resume their assault. As Sarah ran toward the helicopter, she felt a sharp impact in her chest and stumbled. A Taliban sniper had managed one final shot from a concealed position, and his bullet had found its target. Sarah fell to the ground, her tactical vest absorbing most of the impact but the force still driving the breath from her lungs. Rodriguez saw Sarah fall and immediately moved to help her reach the helicopter. The sniper fired again, his second shot going wide as return fire from the SEAL team forced him to take cover. Sarah struggled to her feet, determined not to be left behind after everything she had accomplished during the mission. The bullet impact felt like being hit by a sledgehammer, even through her tactical vest. Sarah gasped for air as Rodriguez reached her position, his face grim with concern. The ceramic plate in her vest had stopped the bullet from penetrating, but the blunt force trauma had cracked at least 2 ribs and left her struggling to breathe. Rodriguez hauled Sarah to her feet, supporting her weight as they moved toward the helicopter. The Taliban sniper fired again, but the rest of the SEAL team had identified his position and were laying down suppressive fire. Bullets sparked off rocks around the sniper's nest, forcing him to keep his head down. Sarah fought through the pain in her chest, determined to reach the extraction point under her own power. She had survived too much during this mission to be defeated by a single sniper's bullet. Her training kicked in, teaching her to compartmentalize the pain and focus on the immediate task of survival. The helicopter pilot was getting nervous about the extended exposure to enemy fire. His aircraft was a large target sitting on the ground, and Taliban fighters were beginning to regroup after their initial confusion. He called over the radio that they had perhaps 30 seconds before he would have to abort the extraction. Sarah pushed herself harder, ignoring the stabbing pain in her ribs with each breath. Rodriguez continued supporting her, but she was moving mostly under her own power now. The other team members had already loaded the wounded into the helicopter and were providing security for the final extraction. As they reached the helicopter, Sarah looked back at the compound where they had been trapped just minutes earlier. The Taliban forces were already beginning to reoccupy their positions, preparing for another assault. But it was too late. The SEAL team had broken out of the trap and would escape with critical intelligence about enemy operations. Sarah and Rodriguez dove into the helicopter just as the pilot began lifting off. Taliban fighters on the surrounding hills opened fire at the departing aircraft, but their shots went wide in the darkness. The helicopter climbed rapidly, carrying the SEAL team away from the ambush site and toward safety. During the flight back to base, Sarah focused on controlling her breathing despite the pain in her ribs. The helicopter's medic examined her injuries and confirmed that her tactical vest had saved her life. The bullet had struck dead center in her chest, but the ceramic trauma plate had distributed the impact across her entire torso. Rodriguez sat beside Sarah, still amazed at what she had accomplished during the mission. Single-handedly, she had neutralized the Taliban's heavy weapons, eliminated their command structure, and gathered intelligence that would save American lives across Afghanistan. Her actions had turned a devastating ambush into a tactical victory for their team. As they flew toward Bagram airfield, Sarah briefed Rodriguez on the intelligence she had extracted from the Taliban commander. The information about the security breach was urgent. Other SEAL teams were operating based on compromised mission plans, and they needed to be warned immediately. The Taliban's intelligence source had to be identified and neutralized before more. American operators walked into prepared ambushes. The helicopter landed at Bagram, just as the sun was rising over the Afghan mountains. Sarah walked off the aircraft under her own power, refusing a stretcher despite her injuries. The intelligence she carried was too important to delay, and she insisted on briefing the commanding officers immediately. In the debriefing room, Sarah provided detailed information about the Taliban's intelligence network, their operational planning, and their tactical capabilities. Senior officers listened intently as she described how the enemy had prepared their ambush with inside knowledge of American special operations procedures. The security breach she had uncovered represented a critical threat to ongoing operations. Within hours, military intelligence officers were investigating the contractor Sarah had identified as the Taliban's source. Electronic surveillance confirmed his communications with enemy forces, and his access to classified databases explained how the Taliban had been targeting American special operations teams with such precision. The Arrest of the intelligence source disrupted the entire Taliban network that had been responsible for multiple ambushes across Afghanistan. Sarah's actions during that single mission had eliminated not just an immediate threat to her team, but a strategic threat to American forces throughout the theater of operations. Sarah spent 3 days in the base hospital recovering from her injuries, but her mind was already focused on future missions. The Taliban had learned that American Special Operations Forces could not be easily intimidated or defeated, even when trapped in carefully prepared kill zones. More importantly, they had learned that underestimating individual operators, especially female SEALs, was a potentially fatal mistake. Rodriguez visited Sarah in the hospital, bringing news that their mission had been classified as a significant intelligence success despite the initial ambush. The Taliban commander she had interrogated was providing additional information about enemy operations, and the intelligence network they had uncovered was being systematically dismantled. But Rodriguez also brought disturbing news about the Taliban's reaction to their defeat. Intercepted communications suggested that enemy commanders were specifically targeting Sarah for revenge, recognizing that her individual actions had disrupted their entire operational network. She had become a high-value target for Taliban forces throughout the region. Sarah listened to this intelligence with the calm professionalism that had made her an elite SEAL operator. Threats came with the territory, and she had no intention of modifying her operational approach because the enemy was focused on her personally. If anything, their attention confirmed that her actions were having the desired strategic effect. The medical staff cleared Sarah for light duty after a week of recovery, but she was eager to return to full operational status. Her ribs were still tender, but the pain was manageable and her breathing had returned to normal. More importantly, her confidence and tactical skills had been validated under the most extreme circumstances possible. Sarah's commanding officers offered her a transfer to a training position, recognizing that her visibility as a target might compromise future missions. But Sarah declined the offer, insisting that retreating from operational duties would send the wrong message to both American forces and Taliban enemies. She had proven that female SEALs could perform at the highest levels of special operations, and she intended to continue that demonstration. Instead, Sarah requested assignment to the most dangerous missions available, specifically targeting the Taliban leaders who were responsible for the intelligence network she had helped expose. She wanted to continue the fight against the enemies who had tried to break her team, proving that Navy SEALs didn't just survive enemy attacks, they struck back harder than anyone expected. The Taliban had fired at her chest, expecting to eliminate a threat to their operations. Instead, they had created an enemy who understood their tactics, knew their weaknesses, and possessed the skills to exploit both. Sarah Mitchell was no longer just another SEAL operator. She was a symbol of American determination and a living reminder that breaking Navy SEALs was impossible. 3 months after the ambush, Sarah was leading her own SEAL team on a mission deep in Taliban territory. The intelligence she had gathered during her interrogation of the enemy commander had led to a series of successful operations that dismantled the Taliban's intelligence network piece by piece. American Special Operations Forces were no longer walking into prepared ambushes, and enemy commanders were struggling to adapt to the loss of their inside information. Sarah's reputation had spread throughout both American and Taliban forces in Afghanistan. Among American troops, she was known as the SEAL, who had single-handedly turned a devastating ambush into a tactical victory. Among Taliban fighters, she had become a feared adversary whose presence on the battlefield meant that their carefully laid plans would likely be disrupted by aggressive and unpredictable tactics. The mission Sarah was leading tonight was personal. Intelligence had identified the location of the Taliban regional commander, who had planned the original ambush that nearly killed her team. He was hiding in a compound near the Pakistani border, protected by heavily armed fighters and elaborate defensive positions. Command had offered to assign a larger force to the mission, but Sarah insisted that her 6-person team could handle the operation. Rodriguez was part of Sarah's team, along with 4 other experienced SEAL operators who had volunteered specifically to work with her. Word had spread throughout the special operations community about her tactics and leadership style, and the most elite operators wanted to learn from her direct experience with Taliban operational methods. As their helicopter approached the target area, Sarah reviewed the mission plan one final time, They would infiltrate the compound during the early morning hours when enemy alertness was typically at its lowest point. The target would be captured alive if possible, but eliminating him was acceptable if circumstances required it. Most importantly, they would gather any intelligence materials that might reveal additional Taliban networks or planned operations. The insertion went smoothly, with the team fast roping into a valley about 2 kilometers from the target compound. Sarah led them through the darkness using night vision equipment and GPS navigation, moving carefully through terrain that favored defenders over attackers. But Sarah had studied Taliban tactical preferences extensively, and she understood how enemy forces would likely position their security elements. As they approached the compound, Sarah's team observed enemy patrol patterns and identified weaknesses in the Taliban's defensive arrangement. The compound was well fortified with high walls and multiple guard towers, but the defenders were focused primarily on approaches from the main road. They had not adequately covered the rocky hillside that overlooked their position from the east. Sarah positioned her team to exploit this tactical oversight, establishing overwatch positions that would allow them to suppress enemy defensive fire while she penetrated the compound itself. The plan was similar to her solo assault 3 months earlier, but this time she would have coordinated support from experienced operators who understood her methods. The assault began with precision sniper fire that eliminated the guard towers silently. Sarah's team used suppressed weapons to avoid alerting Taliban forces in nearby villages, maintaining the element of surprise that was critical to mission success. Within minutes, the compound's outer defenses had been neutralized without raising any general alarm. Sarah breached the compound wall using explosive charges, creating an entry point away from the main gate where enemy forces would expect an attack. She led 2 team members through the breach, while Rodriguez and the others maintained overwatch positions. The interior of the compound was larger than intelligence had suggested, with multiple buildings that would require systematic clearing. They moved through the compound methodically, clearing each structure while searching for their primary target. Sarah's experience with Taliban operational methods allowed her to predict where the enemy commander would likely position himself in a central building with multiple escape routes and communication equipment for coordinating defensive operations. As they approached the main building, Sarah detected movement from an upper window. The Taliban commander was awake and alert, probably monitoring radio communications from his security forces. She hand-signaled her team to prepare for a coordinated assault on the building, with one element securing the ground floor while another cleared the upper levels. The Taliban commander was not going to surrender quietly. As Sarah's team breached the building, they encountered determined resistance from bodyguards armed with automatic weapons and grenades. The firefight was brief but intense, with Taliban fighters using their knowledge of the building's layout to maximum advantage. Sarah worked her way through the building systematically, using movement and tactical positioning to overcome enemy advantages. Her experience from the previous ambush had taught her to stay aggressive and unpredictable, never allowing enemy forces to establish defensive positions or coordinate their fire effectively. She found the Taliban commander in an upstairs room, surrounded by communication equipment and intelligence materials. He was older than she had expected, probably in his 60s, with the bearing of a professional military officer. When he saw Sarah entering the room, his expression showed recognition. He knew exactly who she was and what her presence meant for Taliban operations in the region. The commander surrendered without resistance. Recognizing that further fighting would be futile, Sarah secured him while her team gathered the intelligence materials scattered throughout the room. The documents included detailed plans for future ambushes, lists of Taliban sympathizers and Afghan government positions, and communication procedures for coordinating with Pakistani-based leadership. As they prepared to extract with their prisoner and captured intelligence, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that night 3 months ago, when Taliban forces had tried to break her team with overwhelming firepower and tactical surprise. The enemy had learned that Navy SEALs adapted to any challenge and struck back harder than anyone expected. The Taliban commander who had planned the original ambush was now a prisoner. His network was dismantled and his operational plans were in American hands. Sarah had not just survived the enemy's attempt to eliminate her, she had turned their aggression against them, proving that trying to break a Navy SEAL only made them more dangerous. During the helicopter flight back to base, Sarah looked at the captured Taliban commander and spoke to him in the basic Pashto she had learned during her deployment. She told him that his fighters had made a serious mistake when they decided to target American Special Operations Forces. Navy SEALs didn't break under pressure. They adapted, learned, and struck back with devastating effectiveness. The commander nodded with grudging respect, understanding that his capture represented more than just a tactical defeat. It symbolized the failure of Taliban efforts to intimidate American forces through ambushes and overwhelming numbers. Sarah Mitchell had proven that individual courage, superior training, and tactical innovation could overcome any enemy advantage. As the sun rose over the Afghan mountains, Sarah thought about the message her actions had sent to both American forces and Taliban enemies. The bullet that had struck her chest 3 months ago was meant to break her spirit and eliminate a threat to enemy operations. Instead, it had created a more determined and capable adversary who understood that Navy SEALs didn't just survive. They conquered whatever tried to destroy them.